We're here in this final slot of the festival to talk about a writer who, for my generation and for Nicholas's generation, was a completely inspirational figure. He died in what year, Nicholas? 1989. And since then, dying is one of the worst things you can do for your literary reputation, because you're not there to keep producing new books and articles about you cease to appear. And he's a relatively forgotten figure now. When I talk to my nephews or my children, they are not reading his books in a way that we all were 20 years ago. Redmond is a slightly different case in that he is an ancient friend of Bruce, who has known him for much longer than almost anyone. Very, very old. Oh, yes. Very, very old. Yes. So, as he's a figure who is no longer instantly familiar to many, I'm going to start by reading an introduction to him, which was a piece I wrote in the TLS a few years ago. Redders is then going to read a memoir, memory of him, and Nicholas, who is his official biographer and who wrote a classic book on Bruce, will read from his book, if my phone doesn't give out in the way. So here goes. In the gusty, blustery, leaf-blown autumn of 1986, the painter Derek Hill rang out of the blue and invited me for lunch at his club at St. James's. He was then about 70. I was 21. The reason for the sudden invitation soon became clear. I was just back from a journey following in the footsteps of Marco Polo, and Derek wanted me to bring to lunch some of the Mongol roof tiles I'd found at Polo's final destination, Kubla Khan's summer palace of In Xanadu. The lunch, he explained, was for a friend of his who particularly wanted to see them. That friend turned out to be Bruce Chatwin, and the lunch was one of those rare encounters that only happen once or twice in a lifetime. They really do change the direction you end up taking. Chatwin, I thought, was simply astounding. As we sat in the hush of a panelled dining room, surrounded by whispering pinstripe clubmen, my small fragments of glazed tile were the starting point for a conversational riff that moved from the nomads of Mongolia in the 13th century and cantered over the steppe to Timurid Herat, then leapt polymathically to Ibn Battuta, Ibn Khaldun, Sufi sheikhs, and the shamans of the Kalahari Bushmen. Before long, we were being told about Taoist sages, Aboriginal dreaming pictures, and ancient Cycladic sculpture, and hence, as coffee came, via Proust and Pascal and Berenson to Derek's portraits, and the latter's story about sharing a railway carriage with Robert Byron, who performed a pitch-perfect imitation of Queen Victoria, using the Queen's antimacassar as the Queen's mourning veil. At the end, Chatwin limped off on crutches to the London Library round the corner, saying he needed to check some references for his forthcoming book on the Aborigines of Central Australia. Although it was not apparent while we were seated at lunch, he was already very weak from the AIDS that would eventually kill him, though at the time, notoriously, he let it be known that he was suffering from a rare Chinese fungus, quote, known only among 10 Chinese peasants, and the corpse of a killer whale cast up on the shores of Arabia, which, whether true or not, seemed an appropriately obscure and erudite malady. After he had gone, I wandered through the park in the bright autumn sunlight, rabbits in the headlight dazzled by the whole performance. I'd never come across anyone like him, or who even approached him as a conversationalist. I'm not sure I ever have since. But as well as being dazzling, Bruce was also kind. He listened as well as talked, and took far more interest in my tales of student travel than he needed to. More importantly, he gave good advice, offering help with agents and publishers and contracts, and making me promise not to rush the book, which I wanted to write about my journey. All books needed time to develop, he said, and first books in particular. He said never to accept in advance if you could help it, as that would strap you to a company's schedule rather than the rhythm of the book itself. And he made me promise never to give anything in until it was completely ready. I've been thinking of that first meeting a lot in the last few weeks while reading both Chatwin's letters and the sometimes markedly hostile reviews it has generated. For Chatwin's star faded dramatically since that first year when I met him. He was then near the peak of his success and fame. The songlines, published the following summer, was an astounding international success, a #1 bestseller in several continents and languages, bringing him the fame and money he'd never had before. The book was quickly turned into a string quartet, an opera, a song by everything but the girl, even a strip cartoon named Swamp Thing. For a brief moment, Chatwin became the center of something approaching a cult. When Chatwin died 3 years later, he'd published only 5 books, each of which had been hailed as a masterpiece. In each of them, Chatwin showed himself to be a writer blessed with 3 remarkable gifts. He was a thinker of genuine originality, a reader of astonishing range and erudition, and above all, a writer of breathtaking prose. Prose whose crystal clear clarity and bleak chiseled beauty, as startling as a veery light, as precise as a surgeon's knife, was quite unlike anything produced by any other contemporary English author. Bruce also had the remarkable ability to evoke place, to bring to life a whole world of strange sights and smells in a single unexpected image, to pull a perfect sentence out of the air with the ease, or the apparent ease, of a child netting a butterfly. But as Hans Magnus Enzberger put it shortly after he died, the books were also remarkable for the subtle self-portrait that emerged between the lines. Underneath the brilliance of the text, there is a haunting presence, something sparse and solitary and moving, as in Turgenev. When we return to Bruce Chatwin, we find much in him that has been left unsaid, which I think I pitched from your biography, that quote. Anyway. Within Patagonia, Chatwin kicked off by writing what is unquestionably the most influential travel book to appear in English since the war. Its opening page alone, telling the story of Bruce's childhood discovery of a piece of dinosaur skin in his grandmother's cupboard, is probably the most imitated passage in modern travel literature. As Chatwin himself acknowledged in his later introduction to The Road to Oxiana, much that was most distinctive in his own prose style in that first book began by aping his hero, Robert Byron. The eye for unexpected detail, the awareness of fine graduations of colour, the habit of specifying particular plants, the use of lists, a taste and a mastery of exotic aesthetics. In many ways, Chatwin perfected Byron's style. In Patagonia, the most Robert Byronic of his books remains my favourite. He followed in Patagonia with 4 slim and enigmatic works of fiction, only 2 of which were strictly novels. All 5 books were set in different countries, and 4 of them in different continents. The subject matter ranged from serpent fetishes and slaving dynasties in Benin, through the rural routines of 1930s hill farmers and their black-faced sheep, to Middle European Jewish collectors of Meissen porcelain. All were intriguingly unclassifiable, mixing reportage and autobiography, archaeology and anthropology, art history, and the novel of ideas, often dwelling in that half-lit area between fact and fiction that Chatwin made uniquely his own. The oddest of all was the songlines, in some way his most ambitious and least successful fusion, mixing fictional road novel with non-fiction extracts from his travel notebooks. Yet if it was flawed as a novel, it succeeded as a profound meditation on human restlessness, a reminder that our species has spent far longer on the move than it has sedentary in one place. It was also the final form of a book on nomads that he had been trying to write for 20 years, which contains his most defining ideas, which grew directly out of his own restive temperament. As he put in a letter about a much earlier draft of the same project, the question I will try and answer is, why do men wander rather than stay still? Why do I become restless after a month in a single place and unbearable after 2? Everything he wrote made clear the degree to which he seemed to have been everywhere and read everything. His range was simply unparalleled. obscure writers and unlikely places tripped off the pen in a heady, intoxicating stream. The mountains of the air, Mandelstam, Li Po, Dahomey, the Novgorod Chronicles, disparate ideas from different ends of the earth suddenly found themselves connected in exhilarating leaps of imagination and insight. Chekhov waltzed past arm in arm with Ibn Khaldun. Gauguin found himself nestling up to Mad Kit Smart and a tribe of Kipling's Fuzzy Wuzzies. The couturier, Madeleine Vionnet, put in an unexpected appearance in the same paragraph as Herodotus, Baudelaire, and St. Francis of Assisi. The humdrum and the tedious evaporate in the white heat of breathless exotica. In Chatwin books, people nonchalantly eat fricassee of crocodile and drink cocktails of sour milk, crushed millet, and honey. Even a childhood trip to Filey seems outlandishly literary by the time Chatwin had finished with it, noting that Flamborough Head, according to a footnote in the Edition Pléiade, was the starting point for Rimbaud's prose poem Promontoire. Afterwards, it was sometimes difficult to remember which was which. Was Li Po a writer, a river, or some strange exotic Chinese balm that Chatwin had bought in a market in Ganzhou? Was the Gazagar a form of Sufi poetry, a place in Afghanistan, or a bookshop in Paris, which had made his famous moleskin notebooks? There is, of course, something very un-English in all this, something refreshingly continental in Chatwin's brazen lack of embarrassment about being so ostentatious in his erudition. Maybe it is this that accounted for his success in Europe. Of modern English authors, only McEwan, Rushdie, and Barnes are taken quite so seriously beyond the Channel. It may also account for his deep ambiguity about his native land. God, the English are a bore, he wrote in one letter as early as 1971 after a London dinner party, when the guest, quotes, batted on remorselessly about what Jeremy and Antonia or Amabel and Clive were or were not doing to each other. I've never felt such a yearning to be somewhere else. On another occasion, he denounces the conversation of one especially stolid English toff as being like talking to a portico, and describes, quote, the baklava of snobbery and prejudice exuded by daughters of the upper class. As for London, quote, I hate the theatre and the weather kills me. Chatwin's elusiveness only heightened his mystique at the time. He let hints be dropped, but at least as much was left unsaid. The author's CV at the beginning of his books was tantalizingly obscure. There was no hint about his age, birth, schooling, nationality, or career. Just a list of publications and a line about organizing an exhibition of ancient nomadic art in New York. Chatwin never courted publicity and gave few interviews. One only knew what he chose to reveal. If little was clear about his life, Chatwin's death was even more enigmatic. There was the story about the Chinese whale fungus and another about the vampire bats of Xinjiang, or was it a 1,000-year-old egg he'd eaten in North Yunnan? It was said that he had a final deathbed conversion to Greek Orthodoxy, quote, the most Sotheby's of all the faiths, and hoped to end his day as a monk on Mount Athos. Others, more prosaic, said he was just an ordinary English homosexual with a mariage blanc who had died of AIDS. Either way, when he had gone, one was left with an empty feeling that a rare talent had died young, and it left one itching to know more. 20 years later, the situation could hardly be more different. There have now been 3 biographical studies of him published, and if you include works about him, the Chatwin bibliography has now posthumously nearly tripled to 14 books, including typically one only available in Italian, Sentieri Tortuosi. His most original ideas are now so well known that they're virtually cliches. His paperbacks alone have sold 1.5 million copies in 30-odd languages. Even those who have never read a word of his prose have heard the stories of his career. How he rose meteorically from a porter of Sotheby's on £6 a week until at 26 he'd become the head of modern and impressionist painting, antiquities and tribal art. And how he gave it all up to explore his ideas about nomads. He was also famously he was also famous for his dazzling good looks and prodigious bisexuality. As Miranda Rothschild put it, think of the word charming, think of the word seduction. He's out to seduce everybody. It doesn't matter if you are male, female, an ocelot, or a tea cosy. Less positively, he's now perhaps best known for his unique talent in self-mythologization and his sometimes reckless embroidery of the facts.
Well, I last met Willie actually with Chatwin, and in those days, you won't believe it, but Willie was thin and needy and eager, and now he's a great Maharaja, so it's a big surprise for me. And Nicky here, he also used to be young, and I appointed him as Bruce's biographer, as I'm Bruce's executor, on the grounds that he was plainly in love with Chatwin, and only deep love would see him through. But never for a moment did I imagine that this would be the most successful commission of my entire career on the TLS and elsewhere, and that the most magnificent, wonderful book would result. Although it has to be said that Nicky now denies being terribly in love with Chatwin in the first place. Now, this is just a little portrait of him. Redders would come a familiar voice down the phone far too early in the morning. Not even Bunin, for example, was interesting yesterday. I can't stand it a moment longer. I'm sick of writing. I'm tired, said with enough energy to crack your eardrum. And when a man is sick of writing, he must walk. Oh, God. I'm coming to get you. Panic. What are you doing? I'm in bed. Up you get, 2 glasses of green tea. See you in half an hour. I would begin wondering who or what Bunin was. With Bruce, you could never be sure. The new Stravinsky from Albania, the nickname of the last slave in central Mali, a lighthouse keeper from Patagonia, scroll 238B from a cave in the Negev, or just the émigré king of Tomsk who dropped in for tea. Still vaguely wondering, I lurched out of the house. A white 2CV puttered into the drive. There was a sailboard strapped to the roof. Chatwin got out, his wife Elizabeth's 2 dogs wagging about his feet. Come on, it's almost dawn. I'm taking these brutes to a hill farm in Wales. We'll look at the Tree of Life on the south door of St Mary and St David at Calpec. We'll deliver the dogs. We'll call in on my old friend Lady Betchman, and then I'll walk you over the Black Hill. So what's the sailboard for? I said, suspicious. Oh, that's my new hobby. You bring your car and make your own way back tonight, and I'll go sailing in the Bristol Channel in the morning. And you'll probably be in Dublin for supper, I thought. Beneath the first ridge of the Black Mountains, we parked by a track and got out our boots. Mine, black Wellingtons. His, a pair of such fine leather that Hermes would have done a swap. I put on my Bergen with nothing in it but a loaf of bread and 2 bottles of wine. And he put on his small haversack of dark maroon calfskin with nothing in it but a Mont Blanc pen, a black oilcloth-bound Vray moleskin notebook, a copy of Aylmer Maude's translation of War and Peace, Strindberg's By the Open Sea, and the most elegant pair of binoculars I have ever seen. Werner Herzog gave them to me, said Bruce, his eyes blue and bright and eager. He wants to film the Viceroy of Ouida, and Jean-Louis Barrault had this pack designed just for me. But you could get some decent boots, Redders. The Canadian Moccasin Company. Just say you're a friend of mine. He took off up the hill with a strong, loping stride through the heather and the windbreeze, a real nomad stride. In a few minutes, I fell behind, trying not to pant like an engine shed. The twins I wrote about live there, he said, turning without slackening his pace and pointing to a long slate-roof farmhouse set back from the road in the diminishing valley below us. And that's where... His words whipped past me, split up and lost a sense in the wind. The speed of ascent was effort enough, replying to the wild and ceaseless monologue an impossibility, which was just as well, because it was far too late in our friendship to admit that, much as I admired in Patagonia, what with one siesta and another, I'd just not quite read On the Black Hill. "There's a hippie camp down there," he called, nodding northwest at the clouds, pulling their dark fringe of falling rain towards us. He shouted with laughter. "All the locals are terrified of them. They think they'll be strangled in their beds. When I was staying with the King of Afghanistan, he had an old English colonel about the court. 'Your Royal Highness,' said the colonel, 'you must let me remove all the hips from your country. You must let me put all the hips in trucks and take them to the border.' Down on the Lantoni Road, we walked through the hail, and Bruce talked about a female albatross that had wandered northwards to the wrong hemisphere and built a nest in Shetland, waiting for the mate that never came, and about the train he caught from King's Cross on his way to see her, and how the only other passenger in his sleeper compartment was a Tierra del Fuegian. On his way to the North Sea oil rigs, they're the only men who can throw a boat's painter through a ring on a buoy, whose settlement Bruce had visited on a journey that became in Patagonia. He talked about his love for the herdspeople of the Sudan, about smuggling Roman coins out of Turkey, about the design of a prehistoric wheel which linked the Irish to an ethnic subgroup in the Caucasus, I think, and about his real dream, the Russian novel he would write one day. There was the noise of an engine shaking itself to bits, 3 violent backfires, and a rust-holed van lurched up the road towards us. I jumped onto the bank at the base of the hedge. But Bruce, engrossed, was still walking in the road. Surprisingly slowly, it seemed, the van nudged the Jean-Louis Barrault haversack. Equally slowly, Bruce, still talking. "Just tell the story straight as Tolstoy. No tricks." Turned a full somersault in the air. "No tricks," he said, as he windmilled into the ditch. "You stupid bastards," he shouted, getting to his feet. "That was unnecessary." A young boy, his hair in a ponytail, jumped down from the cab. "Sorry, Squire," he said. "I'm sorry, honest. What more can I say? It's like this. My wheels ain't got no brakes." "I say," said Bruce, "how exciting. Can we have a lift?" Just back from months in the jungle between the Orinoco and the Amazon, I thought I'd celebrate with warm scallops in a London restaurant and got a 6-month dose of hepatitis A. Half asleep, eyes shut in the isolation wing of the Churchill Hospital in Oxford, I heard a familiar voice. "Shush," it said. "Don't tell anyone. I'm not here." I opened one eye. So it was true. Hepatitis A induced delirium. You saw visions on it. "Shh, I'm in France. Bill Buford's after me. I'm meant to be writing a piece for Granta. I'm not here. But with you here too, I might just as well phone Reuters and be done with it. I've brought you some liver pills. They're from Elizabeth's guru in India. I'm having aboriginal warts removed from my face. I'm in the room next door. Look, I'll do the same for you if you die first. Will you be my literary executor?" "I'll do anything you say. I want to go to sleep." "You know, there's something else I want you to know. When I first came in here, they told me I was mortally ill. They said I had a fungus of the bone marrow, which I must have picked up in a cave in China. It's exclusive. It's so rare that I'm only the 10th recorded case in the medical literature. And they also let me know why I got it, readers. I got it because I have AIDS. They told me I had 6 months or a year to live. So I thought, right, Bruce is a dog's name, and I'm not going to stand for this. I can't get on with my big nomad book as it is. I can't see how I can pull material out of my notebooks and onto the page. And I'm not going to waste away and go feeble in the head and defecate all over the place. So I went to Geneva. There's a place in the Alps that haunts me, a ravishing cliff near Jungfrau, and I wanted to jump off it. Or, failing that, I thought I'd go to Niger and simply take off my clothes, put on my loincloth, walk out into the desert, and let the sun bleach me away. But the bone marrow got me first. I fainted on the pavement. Someone took me to hospital in a taxi, and Elizabeth came and rescued me and brought me back here. I was so weak I couldn't whisper. I came in on a Friday. They thought I'd be dead by Monday. Then Jules Jensen put me on his antifungal drip, and Elizabeth nursed me night and day, and I pulled through. I owe it all to them. I've almost finished my big book. There's a terrible old character with a twisted gut called Hanlon, and now I have a whole novel growing in the notebooks. I can see almost all of it. It's set in Prague, and I shall call it Utz. Anyway, one day you must tell people, readers, but not now. It's a fable, all there, ready-made, and the moral is simple. Never kill yourself, not under any circumstances, not even when you're told you have AIDS. I last saw Bruce in Elizabeth's light-filled house, which looks south down an Oxfordshire valley. He was in his second bedroom, books on the counterpane, the manuscript of a young novelist he had befriended and encouraged, stacked in a box by the bed. And that novel was his first novel. This was Nicky, he was under the bed. Cassettes of young musicians he had supported piled on the bedside table. His newly bought Russian icons on the walls. Though he was very weak and so thin you could see the white bones in his arms, his telephone was still plugged into its socket. He was making and receiving calls, talking to his friends all over the world. Just for now, readers, I can't hold a pen. It would be ridiculous to start yet, and I hate dictation. But the moment I'm better, I'll begin that Russian novel. It's going to work. I can see almost all of it. No tricks. His grin gave out in a burst of coughing. As I left, the sun bright on the walls, I took his hands in both of mine. A thought struck him, and he gave a snort of laughter. Redders, your hands, they're so soft, I don't believe you ever go anywhere. You just lie in your bed and you make it all up. They were his last words to me, and quite right too, I thought. I must read Bunin and get a sailboard, but it won't be the same. Well, Nicky, he'd be so proud of you.
I can't top any of that. Before I had read a word of Bruce Chatwin, my idea of a travel writer was from my grandfather, who was the first writer I knew, who wrote 330 books, most of them unreadable, became celebrated in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And they were travel books with titles like Cornish Riviera or I Return to Scotland. And then when later the publisher would send him on a boat, they would have titles like South American Cruise Holiday or Australian Cruise Holiday. He died aged 95 in total poverty when his wife, my grandmother, ran off with a man she had met at 17, and he died of heartbreak and no money. And I thought, if that's what being a writer is, count me out. And my position on travel writing changed when, in 1980, I went back to Argentina, where I had grown up, to research a film about the British in Argentina. And I wanted to go down to Patagonia to look at some of these Falkland Islands farmers who had migrated there. And I couldn't find any books on Patagonia, except for one had come out about 3 years before. And I put it in I think I had a backpack, and I went to Buenos Aires, and I went down south, and I was in a bus stop outside Commodore Rivadavia, and I finally opened this book, and I began reading the first paragraph, and that really was that. It was like as if these words were directed totally to me. I had a similar feeling when I read Garcia Marquez's Love in the Time of Cholera, a feeling that is shared by millions and millions of people all over the world. And so the impact of reading in Tasmania by a bus stop, in Patagonia by a bus stop in Commodore Rivadavia is something that really started me in my own journey into Chatwin. Chatwin was a storyteller first, but not until the last third of his life did he write the stories down. I've always loved telling stories, he told Colin Thubron. It's telling stories for what it's worth. Everyone says, are you writing a novel? No, I'm writing a story, and I do rather insist that things must be called stories. That seems to me what they are. I don't quite know the meaning of the word novel. Stories were Chatwin's central obsession, digging for them, bringing them to the surface, sharing them. He was looking for stories the world could give him and that he could embellish, says Salman Rushdie, who travelled with him through Central Australia. He didn't give a damn whether they were true or not, only whether they were good. Chatwin was very theatrical, but he was also deeply serious. His stories concealed as much as they revealed, and he hid inside them. He talked as he wrote, to keep something at bay, with an intensity to convince whoever was listening or reading that his dragons were not peculiar to him. He told his stories right up to the last, going up to bed, stopping on each step of the stair for 5 minutes, going out to the car, as he drove off, leaning out of the window, till the moment he died. In this, he shared the malleability of all-knowing Proteus, eluding questions by changing into a lion, a serpent, or fire. His whole life was spent transforming, says the actor Peter Eyre. As long as he was talking, he could not be questioned. As with a child, he could invoke in his audience a tenderness towards something easily shattered. He was very scared, says Rushdie. He was telling stories to keep the jungle beast away, the false saber-tooth, whatever it is. Rushdie had no doubt what this beast was. The beast is the truth about himself. The great truth he's keeping away is who he is. Say almost anything of Bruce Chatwin and the opposite is also true. There seem to be as many Bruce Chatwins as people he met. I sometimes think he wasn't a person, he was a scrum, says the art critic Robert Hughes. I think I hardly knew him, there were so many of him, says Sheila Chandler. The American artist Michel Laporte likened him to a mirror. Often people talk about him and end up talking about themselves. Something in him spoke to an impulse, a fear that is universal, says his American editor Elizabeth Sifton. The beast is the truth about ourselves, for each of us. Perhaps this accounts for why so many feel proprietorial about him. According to Francis Wyndham, it is a rare person who remains neutral. People feel some attitude has to be taken about Bruce, as if you define yourself by how you react to him. Rushdie says, you have to agree or disagree. Everything he did very noisily, and that creates a response. Anthony Powell recorded in his diary, after watching On the Black Hill on television, I always feel there was something a bit phony about Chatwin. Andrew Harvey, reviewing the songlines in the New York Times, spoke for a younger audience. Nearly every writer of my generation in England has wanted at some point to be Bruce Chatwin, wanted, like him, to talk of Fez and Ferdowsi, Nigeria and Nuristan, with equal authority, wanted to be talked about as he is, with raucous envy, wanted above all to have written his books. He was, wrote Harvey, a writer no one who cares for literature can afford not to read. Bruce's endeavour might seem to be old-fashioned, uniting him to the earliest fireside storytellers, but there is something prescient in his insistence that everything is linked. In his best stories, he gives us license to travel freely. He introduces us to people and to texts we would not otherwise have encountered. He makes the world tidier, simpler, more exciting, a place to sample, at ease with anybody. His vision is both aristocratic and populist, and it is adventurous. In some ways, he was a tremendous snob, but he was not a climber. He wanted to be there, to know everything, wrote Hugh Honor. He had a great appetite for life. What is compelling about Bruce Chatwin is easily lost in a din of bright lights and colours, incessant chatter, and a crowded address book where Jackie Onassis is listed next to an oryx herder. He is so noisy that you cannot hear him, so good-looking that you cannot see him, his work so restrained and cool that you cannot feel him. His fastidiousness is a disguise, says Rushdie, and oddly that disguise is what most readers would think of Bruce. They refer to the characteristics of the prose, where the work is transparent, unencumbered, and deceivingly clear. His life is deliberately opaque. We know nothing about him at the book's end, Alistair Reid grumbled in The New Yorker when reviewing In Patagonia. In fact, Bruce is himself more mysterious and subtle than anything he wrote. And I'll kick off, I'll end that with how, when I came back from reading In Patagonia, it's a journey unlike any other. You couldn't follow it on a map. It zigzags through time and history, the present tense, the past tense, the future. It's intoxicating. You're slightly mesmerized by the difference between what you're seeing in front of you and what Bruce is making of it. So I wanted to, when I got back to England, I wanted to go and meet this author. You don't often want to meet the authors of books you admire. It's always, well, it can be a catastrophe. I rang him up on the pretext I wanted to find the telephone number of the man who would be king of Patagonia. So I went round to see him, and I don't know what I expected, but he was like a kind of very good-looking Polish refugee, white shirt, faded blue trousers. And he started, I'd imagined from In Patagonia, a very silent figure. He hones the narrator as the longest sentence he says is, "I see," I said. This man didn't stop talking. Apparently Marcel Marceau, the mime artist, could never stop talking when he was off stage, and Bruce was like that. Anyway, I was desperate to kind of impress him with some story I'd found in South America. I had, as I say, grown up there. I'd worked as a kind of a cowhand on horseback during my gap year, and I used to wear a red and black poncho like the other gauchos. And I discovered that up in Salta in the north, there was a statue of a man called Güemes, who was the hero of the resistance against the Spanish. And he had led the forces that finally gave Argentina independence, on horseback with all the gauchos, wearing this, a red poncho. It was a red and black poncho. Anyway, I discovered that Güemes was a Hispanicization of the Scottish Weems. He was a Scotsman who'd gone out after Waterloo and everything and ended up in Argentina. And that the colours, black for the death of Güemes, red for the blood of his soldiers, were just the colours of the Weems tartan. Anyway, Chatwin just he couldn't contain his enthusiasm. I mean, he behaved like Redmond. He jumped up and down because he at that moment was working on a theory about the colour red. He had found that a consignment of these red and black ponchos were in a warehouse in Montevideo during the Uruguayan Wars of Independence, where Garibaldi, the Italian unifier, had been fighting. And Garibaldi took these ponchos, and on the way back to Italy, he had scissored off the red, off the black, and turned them into the uniforms for his red shirts, which then became the Risorgimento. The colour then was the red flag flying above the barricades in Dresden in 1948, and it now fluttered above the Kremlin. So the red, within 5 minutes of meeting Chatwin, we had to both of our kind of sense of, I mean, I was so intoxicated by this, we'd managed to persuade ourselves that there was a direct link between a Scots kilt and the red flag of socialism. And the point about that story is to tell you that Bruce made everybody feel, each one of you, he would have found a story, he would have sucked it into what he was working on. The story would have become bigger, and you would have felt magnified and involved. And I think that's some of the effect of when you read Chatwin, the readers feel somehow they're contributing to something that even bigger. And I mean, so that in the end, having traveled through South America in his footsteps, I came up with the idea that he tells not a half-truth, but a truth and a half.
Redders, you knew him from school days. When did you first meet him?
No, it was at a Granta party, and he was wearing a cloak and full makeup, and impressed me no end. And he mixed me up with my brother, who's 7 years older, who indeed was at Marlborough with him. And he told me, though, in Nicky's amazing biography, this is not actually the truth, but that my brother had done all the boring work for him in exchange for hearing, this bit must be true, about the sex lives of the Roman emperors and also what happened in brothels in France. And my brother was a virgin until he was 36, I think probably as a direct result of Chatwin.
But you were at Marlborough with him, weren't you?
No, not with him.
Was he a legend?
Just afterwards.
Was he a legend at Marlborough? Did you?
No, he wasn't. No, I think he thought that his school days were a bit of a waste of time. I'm not sure why, but he came alive as this youngster at Sotheby's, absolute superstar within months. I don't know, little bits of him, just as you said, remain with me always. Not always serious. So we were drunk one day and trying to think what happiness meant, as one does when drunk. And he said, well, Redders, don't tell anybody. So, of course, I do. Don't tell anybody, but my idea of happiness is, well, there's a path up the Alps. Now, I like to follow the young guides. It depends very much on the guide. It has to be the guide I have in mind. And he's always there. And he wears lederhosen, that's leather shorts to you. And I would climb up just behind him so that my eyes are on the direct level of the backs of his knees, the little creases, and that's heaven.
When Redders appointed me the biographer, I confess my gaydar's not good. I did not know that he was bisexual. I'd met him with Elizabeth, who very sadly is not here, because one of the things I'd like, and I hope Redders and Willie will endorse this, I mean, Chatwin would not be Chatwin without Elizabeth. She was the tent peg of his circus act. And he ran away from her, but her Catholicism, her love for him was so big, there was nowhere he could run to. He ran to the edge of the earth, and he needed also something to come back to. So he's a bit like that Montaigne phrase, but I never know I know what I'm traveling away from, but I don't quite know what I'm traveling towards. And I think Chatwin's energy is that he wasn't quite clear what he was either running away from or running towards. But he always came back to Elizabeth. And I think at the end, what is so moving about his life story is that it was a love story. I think his eye that you describe was brilliant. I mean, Sotheby's for art, for people, for books, for stories. But he saw Elizabeth in some way young and fell in love with her kind of prematurely, if you like. And he recognized that in some way that it would happen between them. And he then spent the rest of his life running away from her. And she enabled him as a writer. And then when at the end his illness stopped him moving, and all his looks were ravaged, he couldn't move, he saw her in front of her and fell in love with her. And very authentically, it wasn't a kind of falling in love with your nurse act. He kept telling people, you see why I fell in love with her. And what is so sad is the books are the first act that we have. I mean, we haven't got the books that would have come from falling in love with his wife.
How old is he? He was 49 when he died.
48 when he died.
So if he was alive now, what do you think he would be doing?
Well, again, I mean, he seemed to me a precursor of the internet. He died just as the internet, before it was in a year or two later, and before the collapse of the Iron Curtain. One might argue he died in time, but his popularity seemed to be what we all now get from the internet, the suggestion of connectivity, that everything can be linked, that there are answers to everything, or the illusion that there are answers to everything. And I think he'd almost done his job by the time the internet comes along. What he'd be doing now, I just have an image of a kind of Klaus Kinski figure, long white hair, walking along a beach like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, muttering to himself, probably boring a few people with repetitious stories. I don't quite know. Where do you think he would have found his material readers in the internet age?
I like to think that he really would have calmed down and written a great novel with no tricks and taken Tolstoy as his model for a change, instead of some obscure Swiss author. But I mean, you're right. Elizabeth was the center of his life. There was no getting away from it. And my God, she was in love with him. The only couple ever that you'd have to supper. You had to put up with it. Bruce would say, and imagine redders at the back of the cave, you're just settling down to sleep and you're absolutely safe in the front because the fire is burning. And then you don't hear anything because the fur on its feet, but it's coming for you out of the depths of the cave. And it's called dinophilis. Not that that's going to help you at all. And then, before you know it, you're dead. And then she'd say, Bruce says that dinophilis was living in the bottom of the cave. And, and then you'd have to wait until she'd finished. And then he would say, now, Red, is the other sort of death that I wouldn't like. Now imagine you're living alongside a river in Eastern Europe somewhere, and it's frozen, and now you are terrified. Why? Because the Mongol cavalry can come charging down on the ice. And what do you hear? Tick, 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 tick. And what's that, readers? Now you wouldn't know, would you? That is the leather flaps on the armor of the cavalrymen as they come down the ice. In the summer, you're all right because the little ponies can't jump the walls. Do you understand? Have you got... And then she would say, Bruce says that the Mongol cavalrymen...
I mean, just as you couldn't escape, he couldn't escape Elizabeth, I think it's very difficult for us to escape Chatwin. I remember when I'd finished 7 years of following in his footsteps and interviewing as many people as I could. I mean, 7 years is what they transport you to Australia for as a convict. And I wanted to recover my heterosexual self at the end of this odyssey, and I wanted to go to a place where he'd never been, and there were only two places Chatwin had never been, as far as I could find out. One was Baffin Island, which seemed a bit cold, and the other was Tasmania. So I knew nothing about Tasmania, so I go with my girlfriend to Tasmania on a trek, and it's a Chatwin-free zone. I'm so thrilled. For the first time, I'm in a world that he hasn't written about, and it's wonderful. I can actually make my own mess. It's kind of, I don't have to see these clear skies, and it's great. And then I go to a village called Kindred, and I'm looking in the talking about death. I'm in the graveyard, and suddenly, to my amazement, there is a marble grave, and it says Elizabeth Chatwin, 1860. And then the next grave is also a Chatwin. And I look in the telephone book, and the whole village, called Kindred, is composed of Chatwins. And so I ring up the head of the clan, who's called Max Chatwin. And I say, these Chatwins. He said, oh, yes, you ought to speak to my wife. She's just finished a book. It's called Chatwin, 6 Generations in Tasmania. So I went to the end of the earth to get away from him, only to find an entire village of Chatwins, and they'd all descended from his uncle, great uncle who jumped ship in the Melbourne Gold Rush. So the point is, that's a metaphor for the fact I think writers can't get away. He influenced you, Willie, didn't he?
Oh, completely. And my first draft of In Xanadu, I got this contract in my last year at college and spent the whole of that year sort of living off it and sort of trying to get girls to go out to dinner with me because I had this publishing contract. And it was very much, you know. Anyway, I wrote this first draft of the thing, and entirely aping, as I thought, the style of In Patagonia, with this very short sentences and oblique full stops. And anyway, I handed it in, and I was going off to India. And the night before, I came back from the farewell party, and there was, in the days of answering machines, you know, there was a flashing light, and I pressed the button. And there was my editor saying, Willie, these are notes, aren't they? Because if you think this is finished prose, we're going to have to ask for that advance back. But I really spent most of it. And, so in some ways, he was like Robert Byron. His style was so much his own, and so totally uncopyable that he can easily lead you astray. No one else can do Chatwin except Chatwin.
I think one of the things I'd like to defend is that he got slightly, people thought he made things up. And when I've 3 times I've been in his footsteps through Patagonia, and the instances of mere invention are almost non-existent. I was talking to Redders earlier. Paradoxically, he didn't have an imaginative or a novel-writing imagination. His creativity was to connect. If he talked to you about stories, he had experienced them. He'd met the people he told you about. He'd read the books offered in translation. I think he had the kind of fear of the autodidact. He never went to university. Like people like Colin Thubron and Patrick Leigh Fermor and Norman Lewis. I mean, a great tradition of English travel writers had never been to university, and this autodidacticism, they're desperate to actually overdo their research, and that's what gives it a lot of Bruce's. He wasn't a fraud.
If there's someone in the audience here who hasn't read his work, which would you have a favourite of all those books which you would recommend? What would you?
I think he's only written 5, so you're not going to kind of waste too much time reading all of them. But I think In Patagonia is still fantastic, and I think the songlines, which is a kind of metaphor for restlessness, as you've said, is fantastic. It's flawed. It's about 2 different myths which don't kind of work together. But I think it's an extraordinary book, and it's original, and it's inspired a lot of people to put on backpacks and travel the world, thinking they can answer it.
I think the saddest thing about his death, pretty silly thing to say, but how delighted he'd be, how he would tell everybody, and he would absorb all these stories about his own life and retell them. That he died before he could read your biography.
And again, I mean, you know, in a sense, we all fell in love with him and were dazzled by him. He's been dead 20 years now. He's not the name he was. Many people here do not know who he is. How great a writer, leaving the personality, the magnetism, the good looks, everything else apart. How do you think his reputation as a writer stands up 20 years later?
Well, I think in England, he's regarded with great suspicion. He's too good-looking, he speaks French, he has theories. I mean, the English hate all of that. And I think his reputation is now, I mean, he's like in and out of fashion. I think many writers have periods, I mean, even War 20 years ago was completely out of fashion. He's now probably regarded as the greatest English male novelist of the 20th century, or late 20th century. I mean, I think the books are so well crafted, like Fabergé. They're kind of this dense and yet clear crystal that they will always be picked up and read. But on the continent, he is regarded with enormous reverence. Particularly, there's a Chatwin Prize every year. I mean, there's no other city in either England or let alone Europe that has a prize to an English writer every year. And I think amongst European intellectuals and writers, he is still very, very highly regarded and continues to be.
His work, the man apart, the work, how does it stand up 20 years later?
Well, I think In Patagonia is a great classic, and you're right about songlines. And also you're right, in France, people will say to you, mais il est délicieux. He's not forgotten at all. I think it's coming to all of us probably, just, well, Thank God for great libraries, and may they never burn their books. So you can always find one.
We've got time for a couple of questions. Any queries? The last minutes of this festival? None? None. Yes.
Do we have any books on marshlands about elephants? I'm an MSc Environmental Science student. I mean, a postgraduate. So I just want to say if there's a book on ecosystem, the estuaries, the swamps, the marshlands.
If you said, are there any books on marshes?
No, there must be, but I want to explore them.
Yes. Well,
The one that you
start
could
with
recommend.
also was a friend of mine. My name's Wilfred Thesiger, old chap. I read, called the Marsh Arabs. Lovely, lovely people. Never came across a case of homosexuality myself, but no, you read it.
The Marsh Arabs by Wilfred Thesiger. All right then, so thank you all for coming to this festival. We have one last session, I think, here. What's it next?
So the next session coming up is called India's Elephants as a Cultural Legacy. Thank you very, very much to Redmond O'Hanlon,
big round of applause
Nicholas
for Nicholas Shakespeare, Redmond O'Hanlon.
and William Dalrymple. Thank you very much for that wonderful conversation about Bruce Chatwin. So as William says, next up we have India's Elephants, a Cultural